In response to an ever-increasing threat against English-held territory in France, Edward III opted immediately for a military response. To further boost his forces, Edward hired as many mercenaries as he could find and from wherever they could be found. Once the first part of his preparations for war had been completed, Edward headed for the English coast, where he and his army assembled. He bade his farewell to his beloved wife Philippa, and appointed men close to him to oversee the governance of England whilst the king was away. Boarding the ship alongside Edward was his son and heir, the Black Prince. This would be the campaign which would immortalise the Black Prince forever. The English expedition set out from Southampton harbour in the summer of 1346. Weather appeared to be in the favour of the English expedition as they headed for Gascony, but the situation soon changed and the fleet was forced back to Cornwall, where they would be held up for a week. The frustration must have been immense for the English king, but after being advised on the matter as to what to do next, Edward decided to change his plan to go to Gascony and instead switched his destination for Normandy. The weather soon improved and the English fleet successfully landed in France. Their arrival was predictably greeted with much alarm, and the French king, Philip VI, was immediately notified. Philip, however, was already aware of the imminent danger, as the English fleet, given its size, had already been spotted off the Normandy coast well before its arrival. Philip immediately ordered his nobility to prepare for the defence of the realm. When they had disembarked in Normandy, the English fleet made a council of war. A portion of the army was to follow the progress by sea, whilst the remainder of the army was split into 3 columns led by the king. Taking whatever they came across, both on land and on sea, the first significant English capture was Barfleur. They plundered the town, but a general massacre was avoided and Barfleur was left reasonably intact, though impoverished by what the English had seized. Edward's progress through Normandy continued to be met with very little resistance, but as the campaign went on, the English gradually grew more and more aggressive, and towns, like Valognes, were not just sacked, but also burnt to the ground. And the devastation continued, and it proved too much for King Philip of France to bear, and he now vowed to enjoin the English king in battle. Philip then pleaded for assistance from the Holy Roman Empire, which he received. Men from different regions of the empire, including places like Luxembourg, heeded Philip's call and joined his army. This good news was desperately needed for Philip. Edward was continuing to cause chaos, and he and his men were now headed for Caen. When they arrived, the townspeople of Caen were in defiant mood. Some of the nobility there wished to cede some ground to the English and prepare for a stubborn defence of the main part of Caen due to its lack of natural protection. The townspeople would not hear of it, and instead they wanted to meet the English army head-on. The defiance didn't last long. On seeing the sight of the mighty English army before them, the defenders of Caen soon fell into disarray, and they fled in a panic. The result was a total slaughter, as Caen had now fallen to Edward III. The English army, through their military successes, had enriched themselves in remarkable fashion. Clothes, jewellery, and gold of astonishing value were taken from Caen, during 3 days of plunder, and they were sent to be stored on the English-held ships. And it wasn't just objects that were seized either, but also hostages were taken. It's said that over 60 knights and 300 of the richest citizens of Cannes were taken hostage. Moving on, Edward III then found himself delayed as there were no usable bridges to cross the River Seine. He was held up for 5 days whilst one was constructed. Understandably, fear in France was now spreading. The people of Paris begged their king not to abandon them in case of English attack. Philip had to ease their fears by assuring them that he was only departing from Paris in order to put a halt to the English advance. And indeed, Philip was now finally in hot pursuit of Edward. He had managed to delay the English crossing the rivers Seine and then Somme, either by destroying the bridges or manning them with a great number of soldiers. And as a result, Philip was now catching the English army up fast. And so quick was the French march that they arrived at a town where the English had left behind food still being prepared and other provisions that were clearly being used. The English had clearly been made aware of Philip's rapid approach, and so beat a hasty retreat before the French could catch them off guard. But despite this, Edward still had a problem. He was desperate to cross over the River Somme, and Philip was very keen to prevent this from happening. And so Philip sent a large force to thwart Edward's attempts to cross the Somme. But at low tide, Edward made his charge. And though he suffered significant losses, he and his men eventually reached the other side of the Somme. This was a blow to Philip, as he expected the battle to be fought at the Somme, with Edward cornered in. After they had successfully crossed the Somme, Edward and his men made their way towards Crecy, and it was here that Edward decided that he would enjoin Philip VI in battle. Edward knew that he was significantly outnumbered by the French king, possibly by as many as 2 to 3 to 1. But Edward had great faith in the ability of his men and also his military tactics, and it soon became clear that he was a far better military leader than Philip VI, whose ranks would be embroiled in chaos and confusion and complete disorder. On the morning of the battle, Edward III, alongside his son Edward the Black Prince, heard Mass. Likewise, Philip VI also took Mass. As he had done throughout his campaign so far, Edward III then organised his men into 3 divisions. His son and heir, the Black Prince, would take charge of the 1st division. Edward III would take charge of the 3rd division. So father and son would be separated throughout the duration of the battle. But Edward III had great faith in his son's ability, and he stated that this would be the day that his son would earn his spurs. And indeed he did, and Edward the Black Prince is now immortalised as one of the greatest warriors of medieval history. The French king was also advised to organise his army, which he agreed to, but unfortunately for Philip, this does not seem to have been carried out very well. When his army began to make their first move towards the English army, who were staying resolutely still, Disorder soon broke out as the men at the front of the French army recoiled at the sight of the English men in the positions that they were holding, as it was clear that they were becoming very well organised. And so, with the confusion that was caused by the retreat of the men at the front of the French army, chaos soon followed behind them, and the first French advance ended in shambles. And this was a precursor to what was to happen throughout the battle. Further chaos soon reigned in Philip's ranks. Alongside him, he had some Genoese allies, numbering around several thousand. But at first they refused to join the English in battle, and it took them some persuasion for the Genoese to eventually march forward. But sadly for them, they were soon picked off by the English and Welsh archers. And so poor was the Genoese effort in their advance that the French became enraged with them, and Philip VI actually ordered his own men to start attacking the Genoese allies. This goes to show you the lack of organisation that was now starting to cripple Philip's army. One man who did conduct himself a little bit better than the Genoese had done was John, the blind king of Bohemia. This is a remarkable and somewhat tragic tale from the Battle of Crecy. John, as I mentioned, was blind, but he was so eager to take part in the fighting, and his loyal followers were such that they tied their horses together so John could make at least a proper advance on the English army. But obviously this led to nothing more than a quick death for John, and he died a noble but ultimately pointless and needless death, really. The only area of progress that the French made throughout the Battle of Crecy was when some French knights actually made some progress in the area where the Black Prince was fighting. They cut a path through the division of Edward the Black Prince, but so ferocious was the English response that eventually this was halted, and the Black Prince had, as his father had said he would do, had earned his spurs. And as night drew on, Philip VI recognised that the battle was now very much lost. It had been a total disaster for him. Huge numbers of his nobility died. He had suffered significant losses in his army, and the French had managed to do very little damage to the English army, who lost no more than a few hundred men. The formidable English archers had undoubtedly caused the French a tremendous amount of damage, and had struck fear certainly in the Genoese men. But ultimately the lack of leadership from Philip, the disorganisation in the ranks, stood in stark contrast to how Edward had set up his men. They entrusted their military tactics right from the start of the battle. And that's why when the first French advance took place, the English stood still and waited. The French, from the early start of the battle, were in total chaos. And ultimately, what the Battle of Crecy had now done was not just created one potential foe for them who could be a potential problem for a long time to come in Edward III, but it had also created another foe for them, Edward the Black Prince, and he would cause them further damage in the years to come. And it has to be said, he was just 16 years old at this battle, so it stands as one of the most remarkable achievements in medieval history for a 16-year-old to do what he done at Crecy. And it is because of the Battle of Crecy that Edward III had started to firmly establish himself as one of the greatest warrior kings in English history.